The F-35 is one of the world's most advanced fighters. So why did the US Air Force take it to Utah, load it with live weapons, and put the entire operation under pressure? Because the real test wasn't just the aircraft, it was everything keeping it in the fight. Combat Hammer 26.07 wasn't simply another week of pilots practicing with their aircraft. It was part of the Air Force's Weapon System Evaluation Program, or WSEP. That distinction matters because the goal isn't just to get pilots into the air, the goal is to evaluate whether a weapon system can actually perform a specific mission under demanding conditions. For this exercise, the focus was the F-35A's air-to-ground capability and its precision-guided weapons. And this time, the weapons were real. The 325th Fighter Wing traveled from Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida to Hill Air Force Base in Utah, where it joined the 86th Fighter Weapons Squadron for the evaluation. Over 10 days, the F-35A crews weren't simply flying around a familiar training area, they were operating in an environment designed to expose them to a different set of problems. The Air Force itself described the exercise as supporting three major priorities: readiness, lethality, and agile combat employment. That last one is especially important because the exercise wasn't only asking, can an F-35 hit a target? It was asking a much harder question. Can an entire combat team generate useful air power when it's pulled away from its normal environment? That changes the meaning of the exercise. A fighter can have incredible sensors, advanced avionics, and precision weapons, but none of that matters if the aircraft can't be properly armed, maintained, launched, and recovered. And Utah was chosen for a reason. The terrain was about to become part of the test. For an F-35 pilot based at Tyndall, Utah offers something the home station simply can't: mountains. Tyndall's F-35 training environment is heavily influenced by its location along Florida's Gulf Coast. That gives pilots valuable experience, but it doesn't provide the same kind of terrain found around Hill Air Force Base. Captain Simon Little, one of the F-35 pilots participating in Combat Hammer, explained the difference directly. At Tyndall, he said, the squadron doesn't get much exposure to its air-to-ground mission because so much of its training happens over the Gulf. Utah changes that. Suddenly, pilots are dealing with mountains, valleys, changing elevations, and terrain that can block their view and complicate how they approach a target. One technique becomes especially important here: terrain masking. The basic idea is simple. Instead of giving an enemy radar or observer a clear view of the aircraft, a pilot can use the terrain itself to interfere with that line of sight. A mountain isn't just something to fly around. In the right situation, it becomes cover. That means the pilot has to think about altitude, speed, geography, visibility, and the target at the same time. Then comes the difficult part. At some point, the aircraft has to expose itself enough to find and engage what it's looking for. That's why training over mountains is fundamentally different from simply practicing over open water. And the Air Force wasn't claiming that Utah perfectly recreates a real enemy air defense network. The public information doesn't give us enough detail to make that claim. But the structural difference is obvious. The Air Force deliberately moved the F-35 away from its normal training environment and placed it somewhere that forced pilots to deal with more complicated terrain. And then it added something that makes every part of the mission more serious: live ordnance. The Air Force noted that working with live weapons creates a level of realism that routine training can't completely reproduce. For the pilots, that changes the atmosphere. For the maintainers, it changes everything. Because once a real weapon is hanging underneath the aircraft, getting the aircraft ready for another mission becomes just as important as flying the first one. And that's where the real pressure of Combat Hammer starts to appear. The most important people at Combat Hammer weren't necessarily sitting inside the cockpit. Some of them were standing underneath the aircraft. The maintainers and munitions personnel had to make sure the F-35s could actually go back into the air. That sounds obvious, but in a high-tempo conflict, this can become one of the biggest limitations on air power. The Air Force brought the 325th Maintenance and Munitions Squadrons into the exercise and integrated them with the team supporting the evaluation. The job wasn't simply to load a weapon once, it was to build a working cycle. Aircraft return, weapons are handled, the aircraft is serviced, the next mission is prepared, then the jet goes back out, and the cycle starts again. One detail from the exercise reveals just how much pressure was being placed on that process. Staff Sergeant John Neer, a precision-guided munitions inspector, explained that that his team could receive only about 24 hours notice about what weapons would be needed the following day. That meant the munitions had to be prepared, inspected, and moved to the flight line quickly. But there was another detail that makes the situation even more interesting. The team doing this work consisted of just 14 people. At their home station, the same kind of operation involved roughly 50 people. That's a massive difference, and it creates an obvious question. Why deliberately operate with a much smaller team? The exercise was designed to support agile combat employment, which emphasizes generating combat power away from a unit's normal operating environment. In other words, you can't assume that a massive support structure will always be sitting behind the aircraft. A forward location might have fewer people, less equipment, less space, and less time. Combat Hammer gave the Air Force a chance to see how that kind of compressed operation worked with real weapons and real aircraft. There was another important detail. 3 members of the 14-person munitions team had never previously assembled a live munitions. So this wasn't only about experienced personnel demonstrating what they already knew. It was also giving newer personnel direct experience with live ordnance under an accelerated training environment. That matters because modern air power isn't just about the aircraft, it's about the system surrounding it. The pilot can't fly the mission without the maintainer. The maintainer can't prepare the aircraft without the weapons team. And the weapons team can't keep the cycle moving if the whole operation slows down. That's why the 14-person number may be more revealing than the F-35 itself. The Air Force wasn't just testing whether the aircraft could perform, it was testing whether the team could keep the aircraft performing. And that leads to the most important part of the entire exercise. Because demonstrating one successful mission is easy compared with generating combat power again and again. There was one phrase in the Air Force's description of Combat Hammer that may be more important than the bombs, the mountains, or even the F-35 itself. Agile combat employment. It sounds like another military acronym, but the idea behind it is much simpler. Don't depend on one giant base. Instead, be able to move aircraft, weapons, and support personnel into different locations and keep generating missions with a smaller footprint. That matters because a modern airbase can be an obvious target. If an opponent knows where your fighters are parked, where the fuel is stored, where the weapons are kept, and where the maintenance crews work, that concentration can become a vulnerability. ACE is designed around reducing that dependence, and suddenly, several details from Combat Hammer start to fit together. The F-35s were operating away from their home environment. The terrain was more complex, the munitions team was working with 14 people instead of the roughly 50-person operation described at home. Weapons had to be prepared on a short timeline, and the entire process had to support repeated aircraft operations. None of this proves that Combat Hammer was secretly preparing for one specific war or one specific enemy. The Air Force did not say that, but it did explicitly identify agile combat employment as one of the priorities supported by the exercise. That makes the connection more than just a theory. The interesting question isn't whether the F-35 can fly from a perfect airbase. The harder question is what happens when the environment becomes less comfortable. Everyone already knows it can. Fewer people, less infrastructure, more complicated terrain, tighter timelines. That is where advanced aircraft can encounter a very unglamorous problem. Logistics. A fighter can be invisible to radar and still be useless if nobody can get the right weapon onto it in time. And that is exactly why the next part of Combat Hammer is so difficult to judge. For all the impressive details surrounding Combat Hammer, there is something we still don't know. How well did the F-35s actually perform? The public information doesn't give us a complete answer. We know the aircraft used live precision-guided weapons. We know the exercise evaluated air-to-ground operations. We know pilots trained over complex terrain. We know maintainers and munitions personnel worked under an accelerated cycle. But there are no publicly released numbers showing exactly how many targets were engaged, how many weapons hit their intended targets, or how every aircraft performed. And that's important, because it's very easy to take an exercise like this and turn it into a much bigger claim than the evidence supports. One successful live fire event doesn't prove that the F-35 would dominate a real battlefield. It doesn't tell us exactly how the aircraft would perform against a sophisticated integrated air defense network. And it doesn't tell us how long this level of operational tempo could actually be sustained during a major conflict. Those questions remain unanswered publicly. The Air Force also hasn't provided every detail about the weapons configuration or the exact threat scenarios being simulated. That means anyone claiming to know precisely what the F-35 crews were practicing beyond the published information is making an assumption. And there's another detail worth remembering. Combat Hammer is an evaluation event. Its purpose is to find out what works, expose weaknesses, and build experience. So the most interesting outcome may not be whether everything went perfectly. It may be what the Air Force learned when things didn't. Because exercises like this aren't designed simply to make a military unit look good. They're designed to reveal gaps before those gaps are discovered in an actual conflict. And that changes how we should look at the exercise. The important story isn't that the Air Force released footage of F-35s carrying live weapons. It's that the military is deliberately putting the entire process under pressure. Aircraft, pilots, weapons, maintainers, timing, terrain. All of it has to work together. And that leads to the bigger question. Why is the Air Force putting so much emphasis on proving this now? The answer may be hiding in what Combat Hammer tested as a whole. The future of air power isn't going to be decided by the aircraft alone. It will be decided by the system around the aircraft. The F-35 can bring advanced sensors, stealth, precision weapons, and a huge amount of information into a single platform. But none of those advantages eliminate the basic requirements of warfare. Someone still has to maintain the jet. Someone has to prepare the weapons. Someone has to move those weapons where they are needed. Someone has to launch the aircraft. And when the aircraft returns, someone has to get it ready to go again. That's why the 14-person munitions team is such an interesting part of this story. The numbers sound small until you understand what it represents. The Air Force is exploring how much combat capability can be generated with a smaller support footprint. That's especially relevant if aircraft have to operate from locations that aren't built like major American air bases